All right, 301ers, this is video 2 of Module 3, where we are moving into Chapter 6 so that we can better understand human energy transfer during exercise. Now, I know we've talked quite a bit about lactate, but we're going to talk about it just a little bit more. Yes, it's that important. And a few things that we need to talk about are the difference between production and clearance and how can we test this. So what do I mean? Production is at the end of glycolysis. When we cannot utilize pyruvate in aerobic metabolism, we must accept those hydrogen ions from NADH so that we can continue on with glycolysis. And through that, we produce lactate and we release it into the bloodstream. That is lactate production. At the same time, remember, we are able to use lactate. Lactate's not the bad guy. It's the acidity, the increased hydrogen ions that are associated with the fatigue and burning sensation that we feel. So lactate clearance is actually supporting us in good ways. We are able to utilize it, remember, in the Cori cycle, which is found in the liver for gluconeogenesis. And we also utilize lactate as a fuel source in type 1 muscle using the lactate shuttle. Now, if these equal out, that's great. Blood lactate stays fairly low, and we're able to control the acidity that is associated with lactate levels. But there is somewhat of a problem that happens when we are producing much more lactate than we're able to clear. And this is where something called the lactate threshold. And the lactate threshold is very important because it measures the point at which lactate accumulation in the blood starts to increase exponentially. Yeah, this is actually something we can measure. So if we have you exercising, for instance, let's say you're on a cycle and you're exercising, and we're curious about how much blood lactate you have. It's actually a pretty simple procedure where we prick your finger, not unlike someone that is diabetic and they need to test their blood glucose. Same idea. We prick your finger, we take a small sample, and we can tell how much lactate is in your blood. And in fact, we have different exercise protocols so that we can figure out all these different levels of lactate associated with the intensity of work that you're doing. And remember, I think I talked about this previously, where the intensity of work can be related to a percentage of VO2 max. Remember, VO2 max is how much oxygen we utilize. And that's how much oxygen we are getting into the system and shuttling to the electron transport chain so we can give ourselves a whole bunch of energy. This is also equivalent to how hard we are working with exercise. A higher percent VO2 means a harder workload. You're running faster, you're cycling faster. If we look at a lower percentage, it's lower intensity. So let's actually look at this a little bit closer. We have an untrained individual here. That is the yellow line. And at very light exercise, not much blood lactate if we were to measure it. As we increase the intensity of exercise, okay, blood lactate increases a little bit more, but not really a huge difference. Why is that? That's because we're not needing a high rate of energy yet. It's pretty low intensity so far. So the aerobic metabolic pathways can handle our energy requirements quite readily. It's not until we reach these higher intensity areas for our untrained individual in which blood lactate starts to accumulate. And this is where we start producing that harsh environment where our metabolic processes can't really keep up with what we're asking of it for this intense exercise. Very quickly, let's see what happens with a trained athlete. So at these lower levels, a trained athlete might experience sort of the same response. But you notice where earlier the untrained individual started achieving much higher levels of lactate in the blood, the trained individual is not experiencing the same results. So that means that at 75% VO2 max, this trained individual is still able to support that intensity of exercise through aerobic metabolism, whereas our untrained individual has to start relying on anaerobic means. So this gets us to what I have to the left here, where it's called lactate threshold. This point right here is what we would consider the lactate threshold for this untrained individual. This is the point. This is the intensity level where an individual can keep lactate levels under control. But if we go up just a little bit and we try to sustain energy at this we try to sustain exercise at this particular point in time, lactate levels are going to continually rise and rise and rise. That means eventually exercise is going to have to stop because there's too much fatigue associated with that. The lactate threshold here for this trained individual is much further out at a much higher level of intensity, meaning that they can exercise at this level for quite some time. But if we go above that level just a little bit, it's still getting pretty intense here, right, with the intensity of exercise, then they're going to start accumulating lactate as well and will eventually need to stop. So in other words, when we find this lactate threshold spot, an individual can exercise at that intensity of exercise for quite some time, a very long time. And you can sort of start thinking about what are the implications of knowing that information and creating training programs. And the answer is it's very good to know. Something else that you'll see, and oftentimes people equate lactate threshold with something called OBLA. And OBLA, I'm going to write out here since it's not on your screen. OBLA stands for the onset of blood lactate accumulation. Sounds kind of similar to what we were talking about with lactate threshold, right? But it's actually not equivalent. If we are testing for OBLA, I like saying that because it sounds cool, we're actually talking about a certain point where blood lactate hits a concentration, and that concentration is simply 4 millimolars per liter of blood. And that is just how we measure lactate. This is the units. And if we're measuring someone and we make their exercise harder and harder and they hit this mark, they've hit their OBLA, their onset of blood lactate accumulation. Both of these measurements can be important for helping us understand an athlete's ability to exercise. It just depends on how you want to use that information. Okay, just a reminder here. Remember, we're talking about lactate and lactic acid. I'm just reminding you here to go back and think about what the differences are between lactic acid and lactate. Perhaps a little bit of hydrogen for that difference. And then remember the usefulness of lactate. And I already mentioned that earlier in the slide. When we are clearing lactate, we can use it in those type 1 muscles that are continually working to reconvert lactate into pyruvate. And we can continue on with our aerobic pathways for energy production. And we can also shuttle that lactate off to the liver and create some more glucose and deliver that glucose to the working muscle as well. So lactate, remember, is not the bad guy here. We're just using lactate as a marker to understand what the environment is like within the body. Okay, so now we're going to look at supporting aerobic exercise. So aerobic exercise is exercise that is generally what we think of as endurance exercise, exercise that goes for long periods of time, and we highly utilize aerobic metabolic pathways to support that type of exercise. So we're going to be talking about something called oxygen uptake. This is equivalent to, on the earlier slide, when I was talking about VO2 or volume of oxygen consumption. And I want you to think about real quickly, why is oxygen important again? And more specifically, where do we utilize oxygen? Hopefully this came to mind very, very quickly, but remember, we utilize oxygen at the end of the electron transport chain. We gotta have it so that we can continue through our aerobic pathways to give us energy. If we don't have that there, boom, it stops and we get all backed up, and we have to rely on anaerobic metabolism at that point. Now let's look at this chart here. This is from your book, and there are a few things to note here. Always start looking at the X and Y axes. I'll do this almost every time. So on the Y axis here, on the X axis here, we have time in minutes. This is exercise. We can assume they're running since they nicely put a runner on the figure. And on the y-axis, we have oxygen uptake. Oxygen uptake is VO2, and you'll talk more about this in lab, but this is in relative terms, milliliters per kilogram of body weight per minute, and this is often how we utilize VO2 for comparison purposes. Anyways, at rest, this is a very important figure for you to memorize, is that at rest, everyone is at approximately 3.5 milliliters per kilogram per minute of resting oxygen consumption. And once we start to exercise, you can see that this rises pretty darn rapidly until we get to an area here where we get a plateau, and we call this steady rate or steady state VO2. And you can see there's a little dot there on top of VO2. That little dot just means that we're talking about a rate. So this is a rate on a per minute basis. That's all that little dot means. So when we're talking about VO2, if we're talking about a rate, then we should have that little dot up there. So we say V dot O2. All right. So when we achieve this steady state, this just means that there is a balance between the energy required by the body for this type of exercise at this intensity and the rate of aerobic ATP production. So we're just consuming a steady rate of oxygen, and this will happen through our breathing and our circulation from the cardiovascular system to support this level of oxygen consumption. And so we have this nice steady state in which if we are producing lactate at this level, we don't really have it accumulate. And that's because aerobic metabolism is supporting this exercise very readily. And so the lactate will either be oxidized into skeletal muscle for going through our aerobic pathways, so the lactate shuttle that we talked about previously, as well as glucose creation in the liver. So lactate is not accumulating in this particular point either. So when we look at this steady state oxygen uptake, we're looking that the energy required for this exercise is being met by aerobic means. So we have this equilibrium. Lactate is in balance as well as stated. Now this steady state is determined by training state, meaning that a more trained individual is going to hit this steady state at an earlier time period. And we'll see some more figures that show us about that later. When we look at this particular figure and we move on to discuss this a bit further, a very important area to note is this shaded area that I just shaded in for you. You notice that when this person starts exercise, aerobic metabolism is not able to instantly give us the energy that we need. Notice that it takes a little bit of time, and this reinforces the idea that aerobic metabolism is a little bit sluggish. Remember all of those complex steps. It takes a long time for us to reach this steady state VO2. But we need energy here, do we not? And if we aren't getting it from aerobic metabolism, you should be thinking about where we might be getting that. But this area here has a term that we use to describe it, and we call this the oxygen deficit, or some people say we're creating oxygen debt that needs to be paid back. And this is quantitatively represented as the total exercise oxygen minus the theoretical immediate state oxygen. Okay, so in other words, in fact, I have that backwards. So we're going to take the total theoretical, if we were able to instantly get oxygen to support our means, so all of this shaded in, and so I'm going to continue on because this is the amount of oxygen that we need. So all of this, if I were to shade in this whole box, that would be total theoretical if we were able to do it immediately. But we aren't. We are having oxygen slowly get to a steady state, and so now we have this is really what we're talking about. If we were able to take the total theoretical, which is the big box, minus what I just shaded in here, then we get this shaded area here. And that is what is considered oxygen deficit. Okay, so the oxygen deficit. Systems, as a reminder, aren't just turning on and off. So when we talk about aerobic metabolism, we're not just talking about our aerobic pathways. Hey, we're doing some endurance exercise, let's turn on. And the anaerobic pathways are just like, well, it's aerobic exercise, so I guess we're going to chill out for a while. The anaerobic systems, we'll find out here in these different figures we're looking at, are actually supporting what's going on with endurance type athletics. And just to give you an idea, let's put up a little line here. And this is oxygen deficit. Remember that the original shaded area on the last slide, the theoretical minus the actual oxygen consumed, is shown here. So the more oxygen deficit we have, you see that we are utilizing more ATP PCR, and we're going to use more anaerobic glycolysis because of the muscle lactate that's being produced. But what I want you to see here is that even as we start using the ATP PCR system, so the phosphagen system and free ATP, the first systems that we talked about, even before we deplete these, because we can still use more and more, this is depletion, so the higher means the more depleted we are with those energy stores. Before we even get to full depletion, you can see that anaerobic metabolism here through anaerobic glycolysis is kicking in before we're depleted. So we get this instant start from the ATP PCR, but we get a fairly quick start from anaerobic glycolysis as well, meaning that these systems truly do try to turn on as quickly as possible. And these systems here are actually supporting the aerobic systems as we're doing something like endurance exercise. Okay, so let's talk about what happens with this oxygen debt or oxygen deficit with training. And here's our figure here, and we have a couple different individuals. We have a trained individual, which is shown with the blue hashed line, and we have an untrained individual with the red line. And let's look at the untrained individual at first. We have this particular person start jogging. We'll pretend it's like this guy here. We'll consider him untrained. And in this untrained guy, he's running along, and it's going to take him quite a while for us to reach that steady state VO2. But we have his friend here. She's been training quite a bit, and therefore she is also going to get to that same steady state VO2 because they're running at the same rate, but she's going to get to that steady state faster. All right, she's going to get to that steady state faster. And so do note on here again that for both of these individuals, the steady state is the same. It's the same level because they're both running at the same intensity. Okay, does that make sense? Whatever intensity that you're running at, whatever speed of a run that you are doing, you're going to require a certain amount of oxygen. And that's fairly consistent. The real key here is how quickly do you get your aerobic systems up and running to support that intensity of exercise that you're asking for. So as we move forward, steady state values are the same. It's just that the trained person gets there more quickly. So what does that mean for the oxygen debt? This is how much oxygen debt that the untrained individual is experiencing, and this is the amount of oxygen debt that the trained individual is experiencing. It is less, and that's what's important. It's less. Why is that important? It's important because we have a period in which we are going to have continual oxygen consumption despite exercise stopping. Let's look at these figures so we understand. Previously, what we looked at was this portion right here. We rest to exercise. And then now we're actually including something new where exercise is stopping, but we're still looking at what's happening with oxygen consumption. Okay, so I don't need to tell you guys this, but when you exercise, you are consuming oxygen to help support your energetic needs, right? So when you stop exercising, technically what should happen with your breathing? Well, if you don't need oxygen anymore to support energy requirements, your breathing should go back to normal, right? But you know that your breathing is still somewhat elevated after exercise, and part of that, we'll see this, that there's something else going on as well in the future, but part of that is that you're still consuming oxygen. Okay, so you're still consuming oxygen. Why, if we don't need energy to support exercise, are we still consuming oxygen? Well, we do keep consuming oxygen, and there is something that we call EPOC, and I don't have it spelled out on the screen here, so I'm going to write it out again, but this is excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. Okay, so this is EPOC. EPOC, excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. And it tells us exactly what we're talking about. It's the excess oxygen that you're consuming post-exercise when technically you really don't need it. And there are two phases to this. There's a fast component, which happens less than 30 seconds. You can see that noted here. And then a slow component that can last, check this out, up to 24 hours later. Up to 24 hours later. That's crazy. Now, in this fast component, what we're doing is we're restoring those high-energy phosphates. Remember the phosphocreatine that we are utilizing when we need a very fast rate of energy production, well, those were kicking in right at the beginning of exercise, and they were depleted as we continue exercising. It's not until exercise is over that we can't replenish those back. And that's when we steal the ATP we're creating from aerobic pathways to help support the replenishment of that system. Okay, that's pretty cool, and that happens pretty quickly because we don't store a lot of that. Remember, those are our quick energy stores. But then we have a slow component. Okay, a slow component, this helps us decide, or actually helps us convert lactate back into an energy source. So we can restore lactate back to glycogen. And this is an energetic process to do. Remember, we're building something up that's going to require some energy. It's not producing energy, it's requiring energy, and we need to support that. But that's not the whole story. We used to think that this was the whole story. But there's actually much more to the slow component. And we know a great deal more that this slow component is about restoring disequilibriums. So remember, exercise is a stressor. What kind of organ systems are we stressing? Think about it. Don't you get hot when you exercise? We got to bring our body temperature back to normal. That requires some energy. Our respiratory system is working. We need to get that back to normal. Our circulatory system, our hormonal system. There's a whole bunch of stuff that changed with exercise that we need to get back to our normal resting levels. And sometimes to get us back to those normal resting levels, we require some energy to do so. And that's why this slow component happens over such a long period of time. And that's what makes exercise great, because it's not only affecting us positively when we're exercising, but it creates this long period of time afterwards that we also continue to benefit from that exercise. Now, this is the last figure I want to show you. This is from a recent, fairly recent research article. Anything in the 2000s I consider recent for some reason. I know, this is it's like a decade ago, but anyways, it's still not too bad, and it's a great review article. And this is looking at understanding exercise and excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, and it's utilizing two different variables together to help us understand this epoch. And this is really supporting the hypothesis that exercise intensity here must be at a certain size to achieve a significant epoch. Why is that? Look at these low intensity levels and look at the size of the epoch. Very, very little, extremely little. And it's not until we get to a significant intensity that we start achieving some epoch, even at short periods of time, right? 20 minutes, 10 minutes. Look at how high the epoch is based on intensity. Intensity really increases epoch. But the thing to note here is that our highest epochs are when we have a combination of both exercise intensity and exercise duration, meaning that they both work together. But it does appear that exercise intensity is the most important for creating an epoch, with exercise duration also factoring in. There's also some research too looking into other components of what's going on when we talk about the slow phase of epoch. And perhaps there's even a shift from carbohydrates to fats that is occurring with exercise. And this might affect epoch, as we can utilize fats through the aerobic pathways pretty readily. Or maybe we have increased protein turnover, right? We have some damage that occurs with exercise and we need to replace those proteins, and that is an energetic process as well. There's a lot of really cool stuff in trying to understand what's going on with epoch. All right, guys, this was a fairly long video lecture, so I apologize for that, but I hope it was interesting, and I will catch you guys later.